New Year's Eve, 1920. 2,000 of Chicago's most distinguished citizens gathered at a new hotel overlooking Lake Michigan. The building had cost $10 million to construct, roughly $150 million in today's currency. Palmer, Armour, Swift, and McCormick families attended the gala. So did the architects who had designed the Italian Renaissance palace rising from reclaimed lakefront. Champagne flowed, orchestras played. Chicago's elite celebrated the opening of what would become the city's most legendary hotel. But this is not simply a story about opulence and high society. Within a decade, the hotel's most frequent visitor would be Frank Nitti, Al Capone's enforcer, who maintained an office with a secret door disguised as a bookshelf. The hotel that hosted debutante balls also hosted mob meetings. The building, designed by a self-taught architect who took ownership instead of payment, would become his home after bankruptcy forced him to sell his mansion. The brothers who built it would lose everything during the Depression, and a family would hold on to this property for 91 years through boom, bust, war, and pandemic. The Drake Hotel still crowns the magnificent mile today, its pink sign glowing above Lakeshore Drive. Before we dive into this incredible story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about America's grand hotels and the larger-than-life characters who built them, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next journey through forgotten history. Now let's begin with an orphan who would change Chicago forever. The year was 1826. John Burroughs Drake was born in Lebanon, Ohio, to a harness maker from Trenton, New Jersey. His father died when John was 11 years old. The boy worked in stores while obtaining what passed for common school education. At 16, he took a job at a Lebanon tavern. By 19, he had saved enough money to move to Cincinnati, where he worked as a hotel clerk. He learned the business by watching, by listening, by understanding what guests needed before they asked. John Drake married Josephine Corey on February 24, 1863. They would have 3 sons and 2 daughters. By 1855, Drake had accumulated enough savings to purchase a quarter interest in Chicago's Tremont House, one of the city's leading hotels. He was 29 years old. Within 15 years, he owned the property outright. October 1871. The Great Chicago Fire consumed the city. The Tremont House burned. Drake stood watching the flames when opportunity presented itself. While other hotel owners panicked, Drake noticed the wind changing direction. He purchased the Michigan Avenue Hotel at the height of the blaze. The building survived. Drake's gamble paid off. In 1873, he took over the Grand Pacific Hotel. He transformed it into the western headquarters of the Republican Party. Politicians and wealthy Republicans gathered at the Grand Pacific for meetings and strategy sessions, while the rival Palmer House served as the meeting spot for Democrats. Drake understood that hotels were more than lodging. They were where power consolidated, where deals closed, where the city's future took shape. Drake diversified his investments: Union Stockyards, Chicago and Alton Railroad, Illinois Trust and Savings Bank, Chicago Telephone, Chicago Edison Electric. His business partner Timothy Blackstone helped expand the empire. But Drake's true legacy was the annual Thanksgiving game dinner, a celebrated Chicago tradition that drew hundreds of guests to sample exotic meats and raise toasts to prosperity. John Burroughs Drake died on November the 12th, 1895. He left behind a $2 million fortune and 2 sons, who had learned the hotel business from dawn to midnight. But John Drake had not raised spoiled children. His sons Tracy and John Jr. received no special treatment. Tracy, born in 1864, woke at 5:30 every morning to buy fresh produce at farmers' markets for the Grand Pacific's kitchens. He spent mornings in the kitchen helping with food preparation and carving meat for dinner service. Historians claim Tracy could carve a 15-pound turkey in under 5 minutes. Afternoons were devoted to upstairs work, cleaning rooms, and making beds. Evenings meant working hotel banquets. The training was relentless, deliberate, total. John Jr., born in 1872, followed the same path. Both boys learned accounting, customer service, and the subtle art of managing staff. They understood that a great hotel required attention to 10,000 details simultaneously: a loose door hinge, a delayed meal, a rude porter. Any failure could cost a customer's loyalty forever. Tracy married late for the 1890s. In January 1893, at age 29, he wed Annie Dowaday. He spared no expense. 50 guests traveled on private train cars from Chicago to St. Louis for the ceremony. The extravagance announced that the Drake sons had arrived as Chicago's next generation of hotel magnates. In 1898, Tracy purchased 12 acres on Geneva Lake from Arthur Kay. He hired architect Howard Van Doren Shaw to design a summer estate. Aloha Lodge, completed in March 1901, took its name from the family's recent travels to Hawaii, where they had befriended the recently deposed Queen Liliuokalani. The southern colonial-style house became the family's retreat. During the winter of 1899, Tracy had nearly 100 large mature maple trees dug up and transported across the frozen lake by bobsled to his new property. The expense was absurd. The effect was magnificent. 1910. Tracy and John Jr. opened the Blackstone Hotel and Blackstone Theater on South Michigan Avenue. At 21 stories, the Blackstone was the tallest building in Chicago. It would become known as the Hotel of Presidents. The brothers had built the structure on the former site of Timothy Blackstone's mansion, their father's business partner. The symbolism was clear. The Drake sons were creating their own empire on the foundations their father had laid. The Blackstones succeeded immediately. Chicago's political and social elite claimed it as their gathering place. The brothers now controlled one of the city's most prominent hotels. But they were not finished. They had their eyes on land to the north, property that would give them what they called Michigan Avenue bookends. In 1916, Tracy and John acquired property from the estate of Potter Palmer. Palmer, the department store magnate and real estate developer, had died in 1902. His widow, Bertha Honoré Palmer, Chicago's undisputed social queen, had died in 1918. The estate was selling land. The Drake brothers wanted a specific parcel where Lakeshore Drive curved from north to east, with Oak Street Beach directly across. The land sat at the northern edge of what would soon become Chicago's premier commercial thoroughfare. Most considered it undevelopable. It was reclaimed land that had been Lake Michigan water until recently. Benjamin Howard Marshall had other plans for that supposedly undevelopable land. Marshall was born on May 5, 1874 in Chicago. His parents, Caleb and Celia Marshall, were Easterners who had come west to make their fortune. Benjamin attended the Harvard School for Boys in the Prairie Avenue area, an elite private preparatory academy overseen by a board of governors, headed by George Pullman. Among his classmates were Tracy and John Drake. The friendships formed there would shape Chicago's skyline. Marshall had no formal architectural training. At 17 in 1893, he became an office boy for the wholesale clothing company Clement Bain and Company. He learned cutting and became involved in clothing design, but architecture obsessed him. That same year, he left clothing to become an office boy for the architectural firm Marble and Wilson, known for creating fine residences for wealthy Chicagoans. Oliver Marble left the practice shortly after Marshall arrived. Within 2 years, by 1896, Horatio Wilson had brought the 21-year-old into partnership. Marshall had catapulted from office boy to partner without formal architectural training, through extraordinary talent and relentless work. In 1903, one of Marshall's earliest commissions opened. The Iroquois Theater featured cutting-edge design and luxurious finishes. 1 month after completion, on December 30th, 1903, fire broke out during a matinee performance. Over 600 people died. The tragedy became one of Chicago's worst disasters. Marshall was officially exonerated, but he carried the guilt forever. From that point forward, he insisted that his buildings use poured concrete construction. Safety would never again be compromised for aesthetics. Marshall formed a partnership with Charles Fox in 1905. Marshall and Fox would design some of Chicago's most celebrated buildings over the next 2 decades. The Blackstone Hotel in 1910. The Edgewater Beach Hotel. The South Shore Country Club. Marshall became the pioneering architect of East Lake Shore Drive, designing most of the buildings that gave the street its character. He created what people called mansions in the sky, entire homes on single floors spanning 7,000 to 9,000 square feet with servants' quarters included. Marshall lived lavishly. He drove yellow and white Packard automobiles. In 1922, he built a pink stucco mansion in Wilmette overlooking Lake Michigan. The house featured exotic rooms decorated with international motifs. He hosted Harry Houdini, Charlie Chaplin, Ethel Barrymore, President Hoover, and the Prince of Wales. Guests signed a hall table instead of a guest book. The signatures of Fred Astaire, Beatrice Lilly, and Basil Rathbone still exist. Marshall's pool allegedly led to stories about Gatsby-like parties with showgirls whose bathing suits dissolved when wet. Whether true or exaggerated, the stories cemented Marshall's reputation as Chicago's Great Gatsby, a charming, handsome, stylishly dressed quasi-celebrity who belonged to exclusive clubs and threw legendary parties. Marshall convinced the Drake brothers that the reclaimed lakefront land would become Chicago's most prominent address. He designed an Italian Renaissance-style hotel inspired by the palaces of Renaissance Rome and Florence. The formal composition and ornamental details would evoke European sophistication. For this project, Marshall made an unusual arrangement. He did not accept a monetary fee. Instead, he took a partial ownership stake. Marshall believed in his vision enough to tie his financial future to the building's success. In 1919, the Drake brothers financed Marshall's vision. Construction began on land that had been Lake Michigan. A syndicate of family friends provided funding. Members of the Palmer, Armour, Swift, and McCormick families invested. Marshall and Fox contributed as both architects and investors. The total cost for land, construction, and furnishing reached $10 million, approximately $150 million in today's currency. Workers built the hotel with poured concrete, Marshall's requirement after the Iroquois fire. The exterior featured cream-colored stucco walls and red tile roof elements. Massive wooden doors were imported from Italy for the main entrance. The building would contain 535 bedrooms, including 74 suites. A 6-room presidential suite occupied prime space. 2 large ballrooms could accommodate hundreds for receptions and galas. On January 17, 1920, Tracy and John Drake laid the cornerstone for their new hotel. The date was not random. It would have been their father's 94th birthday. The location was ideal, or at least it would be soon. Within 4 months, the Boulevard Link would open, an innovative bridge connecting the north and south sides of Chicago with a broad artery. Pine Street, the 1-lane dirt road running from the Chicago River to Ohio Street, would be widened, paved, and renamed Michigan Avenue. Lincoln Park Boulevard would merge into the same thoroughfare. When the Drake opened, it would sit on a promenade-lined avenue with lake views and a direct connection to the Blackstone, 2 miles south. The timing was perfect. The Boulevard Link Bridge opened on May 14, 1920, just 4 months after the cornerstone ceremony. Pine Street became Michigan Avenue. The quiet residential neighborhood transformed into a bustling commercial zone almost overnight. The Drake would mark the transition between the fashionable Gold Coast residential area to the north and east and the new commercial North Michigan Avenue to the south and west. Marshall's prediction proved accurate. The location became exactly what he had promised. Construction completed by late 1920. The March 1919 issue of The Economist had reported that the structure would be of unusual magnificence, nothing like it in appearance, arrangement, or finishing having ever been attempted in this country. Marshall had delivered on that promise. The doors of the Drake Hotel opened on December 31st. 1920 to 2000 of Chicago's most distinguished citizens. Palmer, Swift, Armour, and McCormick families attended. Marshall and Fox were present. The celebration announced that Chicago had a new palace, a hotel that would define the city's image for generations. Guests entering the Drake walked through those massive wooden doors imported from Italy into a world of Italian Renaissance grandeur. The hotel contained features that would become legendary. The Fountain Court, later renamed the Palm Court, served as the hotel's social heart. The space featured all-white decor, creating a club-like, secluded atmosphere. Afternoon tea became a daily ritual. The hotel employed a custom tea blend made from 4 teas: Indian Assam, Chinese Keeman, Ceylon, and Formosa Oolong. Live harp music played Wednesday through Sunday. The Palm Court underwent seasonal transformations. In winter, workers removed the fountain and installed a 2,000-pound fireplace to set the holiday tone. In summer, the ceiling opened to allow cool lake breezes, and the fountain was filled with fresh water. The space adapted to Chicago's dramatic seasonal shifts. The Gold Coast Room served as the major ballroom. The space measured approximately 40 feet by 30 feet with 18-foot ceilings. Herbie Kay and his orchestra performed regularly during the 1920s and 30s. Rows of chairs could accommodate audiences of 60 or more. The room hosted wedding receptions, coming-out parties, political gatherings, and celebrations that marked milestones in Chicago's social calendar. The Drake served as the original studios for radio station WDAP, renamed WGN in 1924. The studio occupied the 11th floor in a room originally intended as a handball court. W.J. Sinclair, who had decorated both the Drake and the Blackstone, designed the studio space. The Drake became the first large broadcaster operated in conjunction with a hotel. Guests could visit the studio and watch programs being recorded. The hotel featured innovations that set it apart from competitors. Rooms were among the first in Chicago to have air conditioning. The Drake introduced color televisions before most hotels. Management delayed installing ice machines until the quality matched handmade cubes. Elevator operators remained employed long after automation became available because the Drake considered them essential to service standards. Every detail reinforced the message that guests received nothing less than white-glove treatment. The main entrance on Walton Place avoided the commotion of Michigan Avenue's commercial thoroughfare while increasing vehicular access. The design allowed guests to arrive with dignity rather than fighting commercial traffic. The hotel's 200 feet of retail frontage along Michigan Avenue would eventually house luxury boutiques including Chanel, Van Cleef & Arpels, and Georg Jensen. The Drake provided 36,900 square feet of flexible meeting space for conventions and corporate gatherings. In 1932, the Cape Cod Room opened. The restaurant became America's first themed restaurant, featuring New England nautical aesthetic. Copper pots hung from the ceiling. Red and white checkered tablecloths covered tables. Stuffed fish, lobster, and crab adorned the walls. Marshall designed the interior in 1933. His own recipes appeared on the menu. The Cape Cod Room would become one of Chicago's most celebrated dining destinations. December 6, 1933. The day after Prohibition was repealed, the Cock Door opened. Thirsty patrons eager to purchase legal alcohol again could buy whiskey for 40 cents. The Cock Door featured an atmosphere reminiscent of an old New England drinking establishment. During the 1940s, it became a hangout for reporters, politicians, and some notorious characters, though it never lost what locals called the true Chicago crowd. Live music played 7 days a week. The Drake had become a city within a city. Now it needed the right guests to make it legendary. Throughout the Roaring '20s, the Drake became high society's first choice in opulence. Chicago's social elite gathered daily in the Palm Court for afternoon tea. Debutantes made their debuts at balls held in the Gold Coast Room. Wedding receptions filled the ballrooms. Coming-out parties announced that young women from prominent families had entered society. Contemporary observers described the Drake as where the peacock, fashion, preens in the sun of his own esteem. The hotel served as Chicago's ceremonial center, where the democracy indulged in what glitter and gay gesture the hard-working society of the mid-continent allowed. Great hostelries had always mirrored their times. The Grand Pacific had reflected Chicago of the 1870s and 80s. The auditorium had captured the 1890s. The Drake now defined the 1920s. The Drake brothers upheld their family's reputation as a main focus of social, commercial, and political life in Chicago, with ownership and management of the city's two most prominent hotels serving as Michigan Avenue bookends. Tracy and John Drake commanded respect throughout the city. William Drake, likely Tracy's son, and his wife Elizabeth lived at the hotel for several years. The residents demonstrated the family's complete commitment to the property. The hotel offered 24-hour room service and chauffeured cars. Staff maintained standards that became legendary. Every guest interaction was choreographed to perfection. The Drake did not simply provide accommodation. It created experiences that guests would remember for life and describe to friends who had not yet visited. The hotel's positioning between the Gold Coast residences and Michigan Avenue commerce proved strategic. Wealthy residents could walk to the Drake for tea or host visitors in the hotel's elegant spaces. Shoppers along Michigan Avenue could stop for lunch or cocktails. The Drake connected Chicago's residential and commercial worlds seamlessly. Chicago's elite had claimed the Drake as their own. Hollywood would soon follow. Winston Churchill arrived at the Drake in 1929. The British statesman would later serve as prime minister during World War II and again in the 1950s. Eleanor Roosevelt stayed at the hotel. Presidents Herbert Hoover, Dwight Eisenhower, Gerald Ford, and Ronald Reagan all signed the guest book. The Drake had become a destination for political leaders visiting Chicago. Bing Crosby, Walt Disney, George Gershwin, and Charles Lindbergh became regular visitors to the Gold Coast Room. They sipped cocktails under the chandeliers and listened to Herbie Kay's orchestra. These were not brief courtesy visits. These icons of American culture genuinely enjoyed the Drake's atmosphere and returned repeatedly. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip visited in 1959 and again in 1966. Princess Grace of Monaco stayed in 1977. The Empress of Japan participated in the afternoon tea tradition that had become one of the hotel's signatures. King Hussein of Jordan, Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, and Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko all stayed at the Drake during visits to Chicago. In 1996, Princess Diana stayed at the Drake during her only visit to Chicago 1 year before her death. She requested an exercise bike be installed in her suite. The hotel created what became known as the Princess Diana Suite to commemorate the visit. Elizabeth Taylor, Judy Garland, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Hugh Hefner, and Julia Roberts all spent time at the hotel. Prince Felix Yusupov, the Russian aristocrat who had helped assassinate Rasputin, stayed there. The guest book read like a catalog of 20th century fame. 1954. Newlyweds Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio visited the Cape Cod Room. During their meal, they carved their initials into the wooden bar. The letters JD and MM remained visible for decades, becoming one of the Cape Cod Room's most famous features. Guests would ask bartenders to point out the exact spot where two of America's biggest stars had left their mark. The Secret Service conducted security sweeps whenever presidents visited. During preparations for a President Barack Obama visit, agents discovered something unexpected in one of the hotel's suites. But the Drake's guest book told only part of the story. In the 1930s, the hotel's most frequent visitor kept his name off any official register. Francesco Nitto, known as Frank the Enforcer Nitti, maintained an office in a suite at the Drake throughout the 1930s and early 1940s. After Al Capone went to prison, Nitti headed the Chicago outfit. He needed an office that projected legitimacy while allowing discreet meetings with associates. The suite featured a secret door disguised as a bookshelf. Visitors could enter and exit through the door, which opened onto a ballroom balcony, allowing them to disappear into crowds or slip away unnoticed. The door still exists. It still functions. Secret Service agents discovered it while conducting a security sweep decades later. The mechanism works as smoothly as it did when Nitti used it. Nitti maintained his primary office at 221 North LaSalle Street. On December 19, 1932, Detective Sergeants Harry Lang and Harry Miller raided that office. Lang shot Nitti 3 times in the back and neck. Lang then shot himself, inflicting a minor flesh wound, and claimed self-defense. He alleged that Nitti had shot him first. Nitti survived. In February 1933, he was acquitted of attempted murder. Court testimony revealed that Mayor Anton Cermak had ordered the hit. Lang had received $15,000 to kill Nitti. The mayor was unhappy with Nitti's lack of obedience and wanted him replaced with more subservient gangsters. A uniformed officer testified that Nitti had been unarmed during the shooting. Lang and Miller were fired from the police force, but Lang was elected business agent of the Hebrew Butchers Union. Business continued as usual in Prohibition-era Chicago. The Cock Door became a favorite gathering spot for Nitti and other outfit members after Prohibition ended. The intimate cocktail lounge attracted reporters, politicians, and what the hotel diplomatically called notorious characters. Al Capone was rumored to have been a frequent visitor, though no records confirm this. The Drake accommodated all guests with the same discretion. While Nitti conducted business behind his bookshelf door, debutantes danced in the Gold Coast Room 1 floor below. The Drake accommodated both worlds. By 1929, the Drake Hotel appeared unstoppable. Icons of American culture gathered there regularly. Chicago's elite claimed the Palm Court as their daily gathering place. The hotel's reputation seemed immune to external forces. October 1929. The stock market crashed, banks failed, fortunes evaporated. The Great Depression began. The Drake seemed unaffected. The hotel's popularity continued to rise well into the 1930s. Bing Crosby, Disney, Gershwin, and Lindbergh still sipped cocktails in the Gold Coast Room. The Cape Cod Room opened in 1932 and immediately became Chicago's first choice for fresh fish and seafood. The Cock Door opened on December 6, 1933. The day after Prohibition's repeal, guests filled the ballrooms. Afternoon tea continued without interruption. The public success masked private financial crisis. Hotel occupancy rates across the industry dropped from 71% in 1928 to 50% in 1932. Room rates fell dramatically. Construction of new hotels ground to a halt. The hotel industry struggled to survive. William Drake and his wife Elizabeth lived at the Drake for several years until the family lost the property during the Great Depression. They were forced to leave. The Drake brothers, reeling from the impact of the Depression, could not maintain ownership despite the hotel's continued profitability. In 1930, Benjamin Marshall, age 56, and Edwin L. Brashears, age 31, purchased the Drake from the Drake family. They formed National Realty and Investment Company to complete the acquisition. The Drake name remained on the hotel despite the ownership change. Edwin Brashears had been the construction chief on 179 and 209 East Lake Shore Drive, residential towers that Marshall had designed. The two men had worked together successfully. Brashears was young but competent, a Navy veteran from World War I who understood management and construction. Marshall brought architectural genius and hotel connections. Together, they would attempt to maintain the standards the Drake brothers had established. Marshall faced his own financial catastrophe. In 1934, he filed for personal bankruptcy. The Depression had destroyed his architectural practice. Commissions dried up as wealth evaporated. Clients who had once competed to hire Marshall now could not afford basic renovations. He sold his pink stucco mansion in Wilmette to Nathan Goldblatt, a department store magnate, at a loss. Benjamin Marshall moved into a suite at the Drake in 1936. He had designed the building. He had taken ownership instead of a fee. Now, after bankruptcy, he lived there as a resident manager. The architect had become a hotelier. Marshall did not simply live at the Drake. He managed it. Edwin Brashears ran daily operations while Marshall supervised design elements and guest experiences. In 1933, Marshall designed the Cape Cod Room interior. The wood, weather vanes, and taxidermied fish created an atmosphere unlike anything else in Chicago. His own recipes appeared on the menu, dishes he had served at parties in his Wilmette mansion. Marshall remained involved in every detail that affected the guest experience. Despite financial reversal, Marshall's social life continued. He still entertained visitors in hotel spaces. The hall table with celebrity signatures from his Wilmette days had moved to the Drake. President Hoover visited. The Prince of Wales, who would briefly become King Edward VIII before abdicating, stayed at the hotel. Ziegfeld Follies girls attended parties. Marshall's charisma remained intact, even as his circumstances changed. In 1940, the illuminated Drake sign was erected. The pink neon became a Chicago landmark, visible from Lakeshore Drive to travelers approaching from the north. The sign solidified the hotel's rightful place in the most internationally recognized skyline. Motorists driving along the lakefront at night saw the glowing name and knew exactly where they were. The Drake had become not just a hotel, but a navigation point, a marker of place in the city's geography. World War II brought new challenges. Edwin Brashears left to serve in the Navy again, his second time serving his country. Marshall helped manage the hotel during wartime. Resource rationing affected operations. Staff shortages required creative solutions. The hotel adapted to wartime needs while maintaining service standards. Victory celebrations would eventually fill the ballrooms when the war ended. Charles Fox, Marshall's partner, died in 1944. The partnership that had shaped Chicago's skyline for nearly 2 decades ended. Marshall continued working alone, consulting on hotel improvements and entertaining guests. June 19, 1944. Benjamin Marshall died in his Drake suite. He was 70 years old. He had spent the final 10 years of his life living in the building he had designed and never formally owned. Funeral services were held at the Drake. Obituaries praised his architectural legacy, noting his contributions to Chicago's distinctive character. The Blackstone, the Edgewater Beach, the South Shore Cultural Center, East Lake Shore Drive, and of course, the Drake would ensure his work outlived him by generations. John Drake Jr. was still alive, living in Tampa, Florida. He would die in 1964 at age 91. Tracy Drake had died in 1939. The Drake brothers' era had ended, but their hotel endured under new ownership. Edwin Brashears had learned hotels from managing the Drake through Depression and war. He ran it with quiet competence for another 27 years. The post-war period brought prosperity back to the hotel industry. Occupancy rebounded to 70 to 80% by 1941 and reached 90% in 1945. Soldiers returned home. Victory celebrations filled event spaces. Americans eager to resume normal life after years of rationing and sacrifice spent freely on travel and entertainment. The 1950s and 60s saw the Drake maintain its status as Chicago's premier luxury hotel. The Magnificent Mile development accelerated. Luxury boutiques, jewelry stores, and spas opened along Michigan Avenue and nearby Oak Street. The Drake's retail frontage became prime real estate. Chanel, Van Cleef & Arpels, and Georg Jensen occupied street-level spaces, drawing shoppers who might then stop for tea or cocktails. The hotel acted as a connection between the residential Gold Coast to the east and the commercial thoroughfare to the west and south. Wealthy residents living in nearby mansions and luxury apartments used the Drake as their unofficial club. The Club International, a members-only club introduced in the 1940s, maintained a lengthy waiting list for membership. In 1961, Edwin Brashears unveiled the Drake Oak Brook, a suburban expansion. The 20-acre site could accommodate 300 guests. Amenities included golf, tennis, swimming, and horseback riding. More than a dozen small outbuildings provided space for private meetings. The expansion reflected suburban migration trends as Chicago's wealthy increasingly divided time between city and countryside. The 1970s brought dramatic changes to Chicago's skyline. The John Hancock Center, completed in 1969, towered over the Drake at 100 stories. The massive black skyscraper provided what observers called a frame of evolution for the half-century hotel. The Drake remained a horizontal landmark amid vertical giants, its Italian Renaissance architecture a reminder of Chicago's architectural heritage. Competition intensified as new luxury hotels opened. The Peninsula and the Four Seasons offered modern amenities and contemporary design. Some guests began to see the Drake as dated compared to these newer options. September 2, 1973. Edwin Brashears died. He had run the Drake for 43 years. From 1930 through 1973, the family continued ownership through descendants. Stan Brashears, Edwin's grandson, became trustee and general partner in BB&A Venture, the family entity controlling the Drake. Lawrence Brashears, another grandson, entered wealth management in Florida. Multiple family members remained involved in the property's management. In 1979, ownership became more complicated. The Brashears family sold the Drake to a group headed by the Wexler family. A new management company ran the hotel. The Brashears conducted the sale through National Realty, their Oak Brook real estate group. But in 1980, Hilton International assumed operation under the Vista International Hotels brand. The arrangement would prove complex. Hilton managed the building while the Brashears family retained ownership of the land through a ground lease. The arrangement seemed sensible in 1980. The Brashears family owned the land. Hilton managed the building. It would prove more complicated than anyone imagined. The 1990s found the Drake looking tired. Newer luxury hotels had eclipsed it. The Peninsula and Four Seasons offered state-of-the-art amenities and contemporary luxury. Guests who once considered the Drake Chicago's finest hotel now saw it as outdated. The Italian Renaissance architecture remained magnificent, but guest rooms needed updating. Public spaces showed their age. The Drake required major investment to compete. In 1996, Hilton International purchased the building outright for approximately $45 million. A venture led by Edward Ross sold to Hilton. The Brashears family retained land ownership through a ground lease set to expire in 2039 with an extension option. The split between building and land ownership created financial complexity that would affect the property's value and future transactions. From 1998 to 2003, Hilton invested $45 million in comprehensive renovation. Guest rooms were completely updated with modern furnishings and technology. Corridors received new carpeting, lighting, and finishes. Public spaces were refreshed while preserving the Italian Renaissance architectural elements that defined the building's character. The facade remained untouched. Historic interiors like the Palm Court were protected. The renovation aimed to modernize without destroying what made the Drake special. In 2005, Hilton Hotels Corporation acquired Hilton International. The Drake became part of the larger Hilton family. That same year and into 2006, the company invested an additional $15 million. A fitness center was added. Executive conference facilities were created. All guest rooms received new furnishings. The improvements enhanced the Drake's appeal as a full-service destination for both leisure and business travelers. 2006 brought another ownership change. A group including Chicago real estate mogul Neil Bloom purchased the building. Walton Street Capital, LLC, Lodging Capital Partners, LLC, and Westbrook Partners, LLC of New York formed the buying group. They purchased the building, but not the land. The ground lease complicated the transaction and guaranteed the hotel would trade for a lower price than comparable properties. The Brashears family continued owning the land, collecting lease payments while others managed the building. In 2013, the illuminated Drake sign received a technology update. The classic pink neon was replaced with LED lighting. The change slightly altered the hue that motorists had seen for 70 years, but the sign maintained its iconic visibility and status as a Chicago landmark. Modernization preserved tradition rather than destroying it. The Cape Cod Room story ended between 2016 and 2017. After 84 years of operation, the restaurant closed. It was replaced by Café on Oak. The nautical decor that Marshall had designed in 1933 was dismantled. The wood, weather vanes, and taxidermied fish disappeared. The Chicago Tribune had called the Cape Cod Room one of the nation's top restaurants in 1973. Nation's Restaurant News had inducted it into the Fine Dining Hall of Fame. USA Today in 2013 had ranked the Drake among the best hotels for afternoon tea in the country, a tradition that continued in the Palm Court, even as the Cape Cod Room closed. The carved initials from Joe DiMaggio and Marilyn Monroe were preserved when possible, a small piece of history saved from the renovation. But an era had ended. Chicago lost one of its most celebrated dining institutions. By 2020, the Drake had survived a century. Then the pandemic arrived. December 31st, 2020 should have been a celebration. The Drake Hotel turned 100 years old. The hotel had planned festivities. A 6-story high 100, spelled out in lights on the north facade, announced the centennial. 100 days of $100 room promotions were advertised. A contest offered winners the chance to stay in the Princess Diana suite. COVID-19 destroyed those plans. The hospitality industry collapsed as travel stopped. Urban hotels dependent on business travelers and corporate meetings suffered most. The Drake's occupancy plummeted. Meeting spaces that had hosted conventions and weddings for a century stood empty. The iconic holiday tea service in the Palm Court was canceled. Ballrooms that had echoed with orchestras and laughter fell silent. By June 2021, Chicago hotel occupancy had recovered to only 54%. The Drake, like urban hotels in Boston, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C., struggled while suburban and resort properties recovered faster. In October 2020, the Drake, along with Hilton and Marriott properties, carried some of Cook County's highest unpaid property tax bills. Financial pressure mounted as revenue disappeared. Summer 2020. The Lodging Capital Partnership defaulted on its mortgage. The partnership handed the hotel to its lender, Acor Capital, through a deed in lieu of foreclosure. The ground lease terminated as part of the transaction. The Brashears venture assumed a 60% stake in both the land and the building. After decades of split ownership between building and land, the Brashears family's ownership interest was finally consolidated. A core capital retained a 30% stake. John Buck, a Chicago developer who had bought into the ground lease in 2013, held approximately 10%. The ownership structure had simplified. But the financial crisis continued. August 2021. The property was listed for sale. JLL brokers Adam McGaughy and Jeffrey Bramson represented the owners. BB&A Venture, the Brashears family entity with 60%, and a core capital with 30% together controlled 90% of the property. They expected a sale price exceeding $250 million, approximately $467,000 per room. The marketing materials described the Drake as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to redevelop one of Chicago's most recognizable and prestigious landmarks. The property was offered unencumbered of brand and management, meaning a new owner could replace Hilton, change the hotel's concept, or pursue flexible repositioning. Potential uses included enhanced food and beverage offerings, reconfigured retail space along Michigan Avenue, and creation of high-end residential units. The marketing noted unused development rights that could add value. Stan Brashears, Edwin's grandson and trustee and general partner of BB&A Venture, did not comment publicly. Lawrence Brashears, another grandson working in wealth management in Florida, also declined to speak with the press. The family had been involved with the Drake since 1930, 91 years of stewardship through boom, bust, war, and now pandemic. If the property sold for $250 million, the Brashears family would gross $150 million, plus the tens or hundreds of millions earned through 4 decades of ground lease income. The Chicago Tribune published an editorial in August 2021. "The Drake is crucial to Chicago," the editorial board wrote. The hotel sits at a 90-degree angle to the lake, meaning that an arrival from the north allows for the full frontal pleasure of Benjamin Marshall and Charles Fox's 1920 building, built in the style of the Italian Renaissance. It's the closest Chicago has to an Arc de Triomphe. The Tribune called it the most recognizable hotel and probably the most valuable real estate in downtown Chicago. Preservation. Chicago urged whoever purchased the property to be a caring steward. The question was whether a new owner would preserve the Drake's character or pursue aggressive redevelopment. Would the hotel remain a hotel? Would the Italian Renaissance architecture survive? Would the Palm Court continue serving tea? Throughout the uncertainty, the hotel remained operational. Hilton continued management under the Hilton Hotels and Resorts flag. A spokesperson announced that the company had no plans to discontinue operating the hotel. Guests could still book rooms. The Drake welcomed visitors with the same service standards that had defined it for a century. The Drake Hotel awaited its next chapter. After a century of hosting presidents and gangsters, debutantes and movie stars, the question became, who would own it next? The Drake still operates today as a Hilton hotel. 535 rooms remain available for booking. The Palm Court serves afternoon tea Wednesday through Sunday with live harp music, continuing a tradition that began in 1920. The hotel hosts weddings and corporate events in its ballrooms. Retail spaces along Michigan Avenue house luxury boutiques. The Drake is listed on the National Register of Historic Places and designated a National Historic Landmark. It is not a museum. It is a living institution that welcomes guests daily. John Burroughs Drake started as an 11-year-old orphan working in stores. He became Chicago's most respected hotelier, building an empire through the Tremont House and Grand Pacific Hotel. He trained his sons Tracy and John Jr. with brutal rigor, teaching them that excellence required attention to 10,000 details simultaneously. Those sons built the Blackstone Hotel and the Drake, creating Michigan Avenue bookends that define Chicago's hotel landscape. Benjamin Marshall never received formal architectural training. He rose from office boy to partner in 2 years through talent and determination. He designed the Drake and took ownership instead of payment, believing so completely in his vision that he tied his financial future to the building. When bankruptcy forced him to sell his mansion, he lived the final decade of his life in the hotel he had created. He died there in 1944, age 70, having left an indelible mark on Chicago's skyline. The Brashears family stewarded the Drake for 91 years. Edwin Brashears purchased the hotel with Marshall in 1930 when the Drake brothers lost everything in the Depression. He managed it through depression, war, and post-war prosperity until his death in 1973. His descendants maintained the family's involvement through every subsequent crisis, holding ownership interests through corporate changes, renovations, competitive threats, and finally pandemic. The Drake matters because it represents Chicago itself. The city built on reclaimed land that was once swamp and lake. The city that burned and rebuilt bigger. The city of contradictions where debutantes and gangsters occupied the same spaces, where high society and the underworld coexisted, where European sophistication met American ambition. The Drake hosted Queen Elizabeth and Frank Nitti, Princess Diana and Al Capone's associates, presidents and Prohibition-era bootleggers. It was never one thing. It was everything Chicago was, all the rough elegance and beautiful contradictions that define this place. The hotel survived the Great Depression when its own founding family could not. It survived World War II. It outlasted the architects who designed it, the owners who built it, and the family who ran it for nearly a century. It survived competition from newer luxury hotels. It survived the Cape Cod Room's closure and the transformation of Michigan Avenue from quiet residential street to commercial thoroughfare. It survived pandemic. The current uncertainty mirrors the crisis of 1930 when the Drake brothers lost ownership. Will a new owner preserve what makes the Drake special? Will the Italian Renaissance architecture survive redevelopment pressure? Will the Palm Court continue serving tea? Will the hotel remain a hotel? Or will it become luxury condominiums with a few hospitality elements? The answers remain unknown. What is certain is that the pink LED sign still glows above Lakeshore Drive, visible from the highway, from the lakefront, from Oak Street Beach. The sign marks the northern end of the Magnificent Mile. It identifies the place where Michigan Avenue meets Lake Michigan. It announces that after more than a century, the Drake still stands. The Drake Hotel stands where it has always stood, at the place where Chicago's Grandest Avenue meets the lake, a palace built on water by men who understood that nothing in this city comes easily and nothing worth building ever truly ends.